Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, my name's Kevin Morgan, and I'm a member of the Town of Colonie's Veterans Project. And the goal of the Veterans Project is to honor our town's veterans and allow both present and future generations to recognize the individuals within the Colonie community that have served our nation in its times of need. The project does this in two ways. We have a photo gallery and database on the town's website that uses photographs of veterans combined with short biographies, as well as the oral history project, which brings us here today. I'll mention those things a little bit more towards the end of our program if people would like to participate. With me today is George Cinney. George is a Town of Colonie resident for over 30 years, and he's a World War II veteran who served in the United States Navy from September of 1943 until March of 1946. Today is October 14th, 2008. We're at the William K. Sanford Library. And I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Cinney for participating in our program and welcoming him to this program.
Thank you.
At the risk of getting a little bit ahead of myself, I want to mention the significance of today's date, being, and I said it before, it's October 14th, 2008. It happens to be exactly 64 years to the day that Mr. Cinney's ship, the USS Houston, CL-81, was torpedoed in the Pacific Ocean. And that's quite interesting, and that will develop as our conversation does. But I'd like to start off with some basic information. And Mr. Cinney, if you don't mind, could you state for the record your full name and date of birth, please?
Of course. My full name is George A. Cinney, Jr. My date of birth is July 11, 1925, in the city of Albany, New York.
All right, George, were you drafted or did you enlist?
That's a good question. I tried to enlist in the Marine Corps the year before, and I failed the eyesight examination. At that time, I was 17. When I became 18, the day after I received a notice from the draft board to report, one day after my birthday. And because of my experience as a warehouseman, there was a potential for me to go into the Army with a rating in, I guess, whatever the equivalent is, the Navy equivalent is storekeeping. I guess it's supply in the Army. But when we went through the classification process in Albany, they determined that so many people would go into the Navy. I don't know how they determined that, but it was maybe 10 or 12% of the group who were being drafted would go in the Navy, so many in the Marine Corps, and the balance in the Army. And I fought to go in the Army because I thought I would be going with a rating. And they told me I could go into the Army with a rating, okay, but I'd probably have a court-martial to add to it. So anyway, I went into the Navy, and believe it or not, I was drafted into the Navy. I did not enlist. They drafted me into the Navy, which is sum and substance the same thing as enlisting, but officially you're drafted.
Okay. George, what did you do prior to the war, as far as schooling or employment?
Well, schooling was rather abbreviated. I'm a high school dropout, and it was necessary for me to go to work. And my first job, after having completed third year of high school, was as a yard clerk at the D&H Railroad in Grenville, outside the Schenectady Airport. But it didn't last long. I had to lie about my age to get the job. And shortly after being on the job, And after having refused to move to Schenectady to live at the yardmaster's house, who had a son who was coming on the railroad in in a few more days. At the time, D&H Railroad had these 1,500 engines, which were 2 engines in one, articulates, built by the American Locomotive in Schenectady. And one of those engines stopped at the yard shack one day, and the engineer leaned out the window and recognized me. He was from North Albany. He says, "George, what are you doing here?" I said, "I'm working here." He says, "You're not old enough to be on the railroad." The yardmaster heard this, and the next day I was gone. But that very same day, it was a Friday in June, that very same day, I heard about an opening at the Albany Frosted Foods Corporation down at Central Warehouse in Colonie and Montgomery Street. Made a phone call, and they were already experiencing the shortage of people due to the war. So I went down and applied there, and they questioned my age at the time. I guess maybe I made it maybe shaving once a week or something like that. And I got away with that because of my experience on the railroad. It happened to be that the vice president of the corporation who was interviewing me was a railroad buff. And so I really wowed him with my knowledge of the 1,500 engine. I got hired. So I lost the job on Friday morning, and I was hired Friday afternoon in Albany. And the job wasn't a great job. I was working in a freezer. But I persevered and got to the point where I remember one incident where I needed more money, but already wages were frozen. So the president of the company knew my desire, and he thought I was going to leave because there were certainly plenty of openings at this point with the shortage of manpower. He made a decision to give me so many hours of overtime every week. Even though he couldn't increase my pay rate, he could give me overtime hours at time and a half, which took care of it and bypassed the ruling about freezing pay. So that worked out okay. And they, in turn, some time later, in order to assure themselves of product to sell, because that was getting very, very short. Rationing was already in vogue. They sent me and 2 other fellows to Rochester, New York, to work for Curtis Burns Blue Label products, which some of the old timers might recall that label, with ketchup and peas and corn and what have you. And that put us in a strategic industry. And I suppose, although it was never actually spoken in the sense, that was to get us a deferment in the draft. But what they didn't know is I don't want to be deferred. So when my draft number came, which was the day after I became 18, I was in the draft, and off I went. But as an aside to that, on my 19th birthday, we were mopping up in the Marianas, that's Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and Rota invasions, where they had the first Battle of the Philippine Sea, the turkey shoot, Marianas turkey shoot. Yeah. And a oiler came alongside and gave us our mail, which is the only way we ever got mail while we were in combat. And among my stack of letters was a check from the Albany Frosted Foods for $500, happy birthday. Well, half the people on my ship wanted to, when the war was over, they wanted to come back to Albany, go to work for Albany Frosted Foods. Actually, it wasn't $500. It was a $500 at the end of 10 years, but I think that they paid $250 or $75 for it. But it was a real fine present, and it was sure made an impression on all my shipmates. And it also made an impression upon me, because as soon as I did get discharged from the Navy, I went right back there and went to work for them.
Okay.
Now, do you want to continue with the employment situation, or?
No, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
Let's start with George. Where were you when you heard of the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
I think I heard it on the radio, and I was about to go to work. It was a Sunday, somewhere around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I used to walk to work from Lower Clinton Avenue up to the Mayflower Ice Cream and just above Robin Street on Central Avenue. And as soon as I got there, I turned on the radio at the place of employment and heard all the gory details. But when I first heard about it, I didn't have any idea where Pearl Harbor was located.
Did you feel that war was imminent?
I did, yes. We were provoking a war with the Japanese.
How so?
Between the United States and England, we established a blockade of the Japanese islands, even though we were not at war. We cut them off from their oil supply, and the Japs got down to a point where I think they had 4 months oil supply. And for a seafaring nation, that was disaster. Also, we had other restrictions on the Japanese. And at that time, it was very popular. It was popular with President Roosevelt to tell, our boys will not fight on foreign shores. In other words, we won't go to a war with anybody unless we're provoked. Well, we provoked them. Then they provoked us with the raid on Pearl Harbor.
So our trade policies
Yeah, had a lot to do with it.
had something to do with it.
I might add this too, that I think the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor really wasn't a surprise to the people in the know, because at the time, it took the Japanese almost a week to get to Pearl Harbor from the home islands, and it's a pretty large task force that they sent there. And in that, they went the northern route up by the Aleutians and down into Hawaii, and at no time did any of us was anyone informed of their coming, and yet we had submarines in the area. We also had ADF direction finders at all these locations, and yet we were told that it was a surprise attack.
But of course, on Sunday, December 7th, you had no knowledge of those things.
Oh, none whatever. I had no knowledge of radio or anything other than to turn it on, But anyway.
All right.
That was an awful loss of life, though. That was unnecessarily done. And I might add, the Japanese made tragic mistakes in that Pearl Harbor attack. One of their biggest mistakes, they never hit any of the fuel dumps in Hawaii. And consequently, we had all the power we needed, or never hit a power station. We had the fuel and the power
To rebuild.
And of course, we were rebuilding old ships, but meantime, our war production was really gearing up back in the States, and that was really the thing that killed the Japanese, was our war production.
And you said you lived in Albany. Did you have any siblings?
Oh, yes.
And were there any of them involved or in the service?
I had no brothers, all sisters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you recall your first days in service? Where was boot camp, let's say?
Boot camp was Sampson, New York, which is outside of Geneva, New York, on Lake Seneca. And the very first day, as I recall, I think we had to get up at 2. No, the day before we went to Sampson, we had to report to the YMCA, which is now the Steuben Club or something, down in Pearl and Steuben Street. And we slept there that night on the floor with mats. And early the next morning, they got us up, our first reveille. And what a ragtag bunch of guys we were. Anyway, they took us to a restaurant on State Street. I'm not sure whether it was O'Connor's or Thompson's, and fed us. It was still dark. Then ushered us down to the Union Depot, put us aboard a train, and took us to Sampson. And the train that we boarded took us directly into the Sampson Naval Base, which required a transfer at Syracuse in order to get onto the Lehigh Valley tracks, I guess it was, that brought us up into the Sampson Naval Base. And we arrived there, I guess somewhere around 3 or 4 in the afternoon.
How did you survive basic training?
Basic training, it wasn't as tough as people tend to think it was. You got up in the morning and you learned an awful lot about discipline. You either did as they told you or God help you. But I found basic training was pretty good, and it certainly got us all into reasonably good shape.
Were most of the people around you people who had come from the Albany area?
Basically, on the first day, that was all Albany, or its surrounding area. But when we got into boot camp, Company 518 was our first company, which was comprised of, I think, 112 people. I'm just guessing at that. It might be 118 or something around that. We had a lot of New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians, excuse me, in that group, and we meshed pretty well together. You know, we were all in the same boat, so to speak, and it was a question of how can you survive this all these regulations and all this discipline, which none of us were experienced at before.
How long did your boot camp training last?
I think it was 12 weeks.
Okay.
And
had you ever been to sea?
No, I have not. I had not at the time, and I loved the water. I was a pretty good swimmer, and spent a lot of time in the ocean with my aunt and uncle up in Maine during the summers, and quite a bit of time at Lincoln Park and Mid-City Park in Albany.
So you were comfortable with the idea of being in the Navy and swimming?
Swimming was fine with me, and the Navy was fine in that respect.
Where, after Sampson, where did the Navy take you?
Well, I remained at Sampson. They sent me to radio school, and that was I think it was 4.5 months of very highly concentrated study.
And how did you get selected for that, George? Was there testing that went on? Or
we had what they call general classification tests, and radiomen for some reason ranked pretty high on that classification test. I know the only people who were assigned before us, which was about 5% of the whole class. And by the way, this classification test wasn't just the people in my company, it was the whole unit of the G unit in Sampson, which is an awful lot of people, like a battalion. And to get back to your question about how we were selected, I can't really explain it other than the fact that I think the top 10% went to radar, radio, and fire control. And after that, I can't explain the rest of it.
Okay.
But it was a coincidence, I think, or maybe not, that many of us radio men received our classification as a result of some questions pertaining to music. But I don't know that. That's just, conjecture on my part. But I know we could all sing together our barbershop quartets pretty well. But
all right. So the training, how many weeks training was that?
That was, I believe, 4 months.
4 months of training.
Yeah, and concentrated training. And an interesting.
And when you say concentrated, more hours than you'd normally put in at academics?
It was like not only just a work day, but it was a work day plus. And you would go in early in the morning and work till probably 4 or 5 in the afternoon in school. And then you do your other duties. Now, and that was 6 days a week. And that's another thing that I had some experience at typing. So I was made a typing instructor, and I was an instructor to my class that I was a member of. I was taking classes most of the time and giving instruction in typing the other times.
What was the news at the time for our armed services at that point in the war? This was probably around November of '43, December of '43.
Yep.
How were we faring? What's your recollection of what we were at that point?
We were experiencing severe losses in the Pacific. Maybe later on in this interview we might get into the politics involved in it, but we'll skip that for now. But we were grossly outnumbered by the Japanese in the Pacific, and we were outgunned by them, and also out-technicaled by them. They had better torpedoes, and their radar was at least equal to, if not superior to ours, but they were much superior to us in night fighting. And if your history books will tell you that there was an awful lot of night fighting going on in the years of 42 and early 43. And most of the real sinkings and casualties was in that period of time in the Pacific. I was fortunate, although all my time in the Pacific was spent in combat, we were superior to the Japanese all that time, and we more or less set the pace on what we would do and how we would do it. It wasn't a question of what we had to do, it was what we wanted to do.
Through your training period, how would you characterize the morale of the men around you and yourself at that time? Were you anxious to get into the fray?
We were all anxious to get to sea and do our part. We changed our minds rapidly later on, but no, everybody was anxious to do their part. And it was just like any school you may go to. There were those who were gung-ho, and there were those who just went along for the ride.
Did you have any contact with home during this time, your training?
No. At the end of boot camp, we had a week's leave, and I went home for that, which at the time was at Lower Clinton Avenue, just above Swan Street. And from that point on, there was no leave. And it was all radio school. And upon graduation from radio school, we were ushered to a depot on the Sampson base, and a troop train was there waiting for us, and they ushered us aboard the train, and we immediately departed by way of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. Little did I know at the time that later on in years I'd become a friend of the president of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. I had never heard of it before, but
now steam was still king at this
point?
point?
Oh, yes, indeed it was.
So these were steam engines that transported?
No diesels, just steam, and I love steam to this day.
So from Sampson, where did they take you?
We went all through Pennsylvania, and we had somebody must have notified the populace in these towns like Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and those towns, and people were out cheering us as we went on by and so on and so forth. And we finally got to New York City, or Newark, New Jersey, I'm not sure which, and they broke up the train, and those of us who were scheduled to go into New England, we were switched off to, I guess it was the New Haven Railroad at the time, and we went into Boston. Having left Sampson at 10 in the morning, we arrived in Boston at 3 in the morning, the next morning. And that was the basic transportation for us at the time. And the rest of the people went on down to Little Creek, Virginia, which is amphibious training and what have you, and that's how we all got separated. But there was no leave or anything at that time. But in a minute or so, I'll tell you how I wound up getting some leave anyway.
All right. When did you know what ship you were going to be stationed on, or how did that come about? Did you have any say in the matter, or were you just told where you were to report?
I had reason to believe that I was going to be assigned to either the Marblehead or the Augusta, both cruisers. The Marblehead, a very old cruiser, and the Augusta, and they were both Atlantic operatives. I didn't get aboard either, but the Augusta was, I guess, President Roosevelt's cruiser at the time. Originally, Roosevelt's cruiser was the original Houston, CA-80. CA-80, yeah, that was it.
CA-30, I believe.
30.
Original.
Yeah, a heavy
yes.
cruiser. That's right, CA-30.
Yeah, in peacetime, that was FDR's mode of transport, transatlantic.
Yeah. That was a pretty nice yacht.
And of course, that went on to be sunk in the Battle of Sunda Strait.
Yeah, in Java, yeah. Mm-hmm. And the Marblehead escaped at that same time.
Okay.
And made it back to the States. But the CA-30 was an old ship, and but still capable of putting out a lot of firepower.
Right. Yeah. So really, all right. So back then, when was the first time you learned that you were going to be assigned to the Houston, the new Houston, the CL-80? one?
As near as I can recollect, Kevin, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Or 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. No, it was 4 a.m. Another fellow and I, by the name of Singer, Bernie Singer from the Bronx, who was a crackerjack radio man and a bright individual, and we served on the Houston thereafter. But we were awakened at 4 a.m. and hurry up, gear up. You're going to catch the USS Houston. No? So we hurried up and geared up.
But a cruiser was agreeable to you?
I didn't know that much about a ship.
Okay.
It sounded okay to me.
And where did you find the Houston? Where did it
Well, it
depart?
was in Boston Harbor.
Okay.
And well, they rushed us to the Houston, and the Houston had already taken the lines up, was ready to cast off.
Was it at a pier or was it out in the
It was
harbor?
at a pier, and we had to toss our sea bags. I don't know if you've ever recall these sea bags. They were heavy. We had to toss them aboard and then leap ourselves aboard. And it was one of the more comical things I can recall of my Navy days. There was an officer there who turned out to be an awfully fine man. He was a full commander by the name of Broussard, who later became an admiral. And he was the executive officer of the USS Houston. And we didn't know, a cruiser from a rowboat. They all looked alike to me. They looked good. But anyway, we got aboard in a hurry, or either that or dropping the drink. And he welcomed us aboard, Singer and I. And meanwhile, on the deck above, which covered him, he was stood on the main deck, and the deck above was over his head. And there was a fellow up there who was a typical Navy goof-off. And he was, for the entire years we were on the ship, this guy was a goof-off. They couldn't break him because he was down at the lowest possible rate you could be. And he was in and out of the brig all the time. And he's up there yelling. He doesn't know the commander is standing there talking to us. Well, you're going to hate this ship.
He buried himself right there.
Did he ever? Well, that was a good lesson to learn. That
Were you impressed with the Houston when you?
Yeah, I was, but I was somewhat.
It was a brand new ship, correct?
Oh, absolutely! It had just completed its shakedown cruise, and
what was the purpose of a shakedown cruise?
Well, you put the ship through just about every conceivable maneuver you can do, like going ahead full speed and then reversing the engines and
put it through its paces.
See what it can do and what it cannot do, and then they find it worthy of joining a fleet. Because a fleet maneuver is one of those things that has to be precise. Otherwise, if you've got 400 ships and one's turning one way, one's turning the other, you got a real mayhem. But at any rate, we'll get into that a little later on in the discussion.
So how were you introduced to your position aboard the ship, and who was your immediate officer, let's say?
Okay. The CWO, which is Communication Watch Officer, is the head communicator. He's in charge of radio and signal operations, the signal bridge and the radio shack. And there was only one signal bridge, but there were three radio operations aboard the ship, radio 1, 2, and 3. 3 being the emergency radio down in the bowels of the ship, and radio 2 being in the after part of the ship, which is primarily for technical repairs, and radio 1, which is the main radio, central radio, which is, I'll show you a little later on, its location on the ship. So we were brought to the main radio, and there was a question of where we were going to sleep, and apparently there wasn't enough room. Why, I don't know. So we were sent aft to sleep with the deck crews, and then they finally got us located with the C division compartment for sleeping accommodations, and with a locker. And it's amazing, it was amazing to me how much my entire net worth I could fit in a locker. But that was our introduction. And my first impression was, I'm not going to make it on this thing.
Really?
Well,
It seemed too unfamiliar?
no, I suffer a little bit from claustrophobia to begin with.
Okay.
And I got looking around, and my compartment where my bunk was below the water line. It's not a very good thing when you get wartime. But the walls are in bulkheads, they're in pretty tight. The overhead was pretty tight, and the guy next to you was pretty tight. I said, I'm not going to make this, but it's amazing how you get used to it.
Well, I think anybody from our area that has had a chance to go down and see the Slater, the destroyer escort at the Port of Albany, would certainly get a quick appreciation of what you're saying.
Now you know what I mean.
Yeah. So how did shipboard life agree with you? How to,
I like the sea. I still do. And we, as I said, they were departing the pier when we arrived. So that continued while all this was, while we were being introduced to whoever. And the ship, the tugs put it in position for it to go on its own. And the first thing it did, leaving the Boston Harbor, was wrap a communications cable around the screws. And that meant they had to come back. And of course we had 4 screws. 1 screw wrapped up with the cable. We had to go back in and go into dry dock. And that was my first liberty ever.
it was a communication line that was down in the harbor and the
Yep.
sandy bottom, and the propeller came
Yep.
so close it picked it up, wrapped
Yep.
around. Oh, so you got off to a bit of a bad start.
Indeed. We left the pier. It was just daybreak when we left the pier. And I guess it was 10 in the morning. We were waiting for position in the dry dock.
Was there much secrecy surrounding departures?
Yes. Although in a place like Boston, it's hard to keep that secret because you had so many
So visible.
civilians working in all the buildings around you.
But when you said you let the crack of dawn, would they try to go out under darkness perhaps to
I don't
mask
know.
those?
You see, by that time, Kevin, the Atlantic wasn't a great threat to our naval.
Whereas initially the German submarines were
They were
sinking
pretty well
our ships, yeah.
neutralized by that time. There were still some out there, but we had a zigzag program, which at the time was very secret, but every 7 minutes, I've forgotten the speed we had for those 7-minute intervals, but every 7 minutes you would change course. In another 7 minutes you'd change again.
With the thought being
Zigzag
to throw
course.
off if you were being tracked by a submarine.
We figured it'd take them at least 8 minutes to set up the necessary logistics and how to hit us. And we also departed with the USS Miami and the USS Vincennes, also 2 light cruisers. And we made the run down the East Coast eventually with no escort, but with the zigzag program. However, every morning before dawn, you had submarine detection, and you had a GQ every morning, 7 days a week.
They'd pick up, in other words, the radar men would pick something up and it would throw.
No, they wouldn't have to. It's just that so many hours or so many minutes before dawn, everybody had to go to GQ.
Oh, so it was a training.
Just in case.
Yeah, I
Oh,
see.
yeah, just in case. The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Well, somebody could hit. Well, later on in the war, the Indianapolis. I'll tell you about that a little later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately did.
It was a dear ship to me.
Yeah, all right. Now, did I assume you went through the Panama Canal to join the Pacific Fleet?
That we did, and we.
How was that experience?
Well, it was a bad experience for me.
How so?
I always looked forward to seeing what the canal was like. I had read so much about it and how the Americans rescued it from the French, and we did what they couldn't do, and I was pretty proud of the fact that we did what we did. So I looked very much forward to going through the canal. But they arranged for maneuvers in the Gulf of Panama. And I was assigned, here I'm just a graduate out of radio school. I was assigned to a circuit in Radio 1. And because we had good graduate records, we had some preference over the other people who were striking to go somewhere in radio. And Singer and I, we were both assigned to Radio 1. I was assigned to a circuit in Panama, a Panamanian radio circuit. I don't know who was on it, but at any rate, I started receiving messages, and I knew my call sign, but the key, how can I explain this to you? When you transmit.
And was this all in Morse code?
Yeah.
Okay.
And well, I was capable of that at that time. You know, out of school, you know how to take code up to a point. And when people transmit, in fact, you can even identify the transmitter sometimes by the rhythm with which he uses it, you know, if you're accustomed to doing that. This fella, whoever it was transmitting. I could not make out what it was he was trying to transmit to me. I was copying everything he did, but he had long dashes. And
was this from another ship, George, or was it?
I don't know. I don't know whether it was an admiral had something to do with it. Whoever was in charge of the maneuvers, but I called my supervisor over, who was a first-class radioman, a survivor of the Helena, Kula Gulf sinking. And I asked him, I said, I don't know who this guy's calling, but whoever it is, they're not answering. I didn't know it at the time. He was calling me. So he listened to it for a while, and he says, well, keep listening to it. And still no one answered. Finally, I called the chief radio man. And he listened. He didn't make anything out of it. This guy's fist was so bad. Next thing I know, one of the junior communications officers comes dashing into the radio shack and says, who's on that circuit? Well, that was me. Well, they pulled me off the circuit. But neither the first-class radioman or the chief radioman would own up to the fact that they listened to it too, and they couldn't make anything out of it. Now, 6 months later, I may have had the thing all figured out, but at that time, I was incapable.
And no one else could decipher it either.
Right. Well, anyway, so that held me back a little bit. But when I blossomed out pretty well, so it turned out okay.
But now, how did that affect you as far as going through the canal and?
The canal was interesting when you were able to get out on deck and see what was going on. It's great. It's really an interesting program, the canal. It's wonderful what we achieved down there.
When did the ship arrive at the Pacific?
Our first Pacific port was San Diego. We arrived there, I can't give you a date, Kevin, but it had to be sometime.
At this point, was it into 1944?
Oh, it was 43 yet.
Late, okay.
No, excuse me, it was 44. It was about February 44. We arrived in the San Diego area, and we took on. We were only there for 2 days. We took on fuel and provisions, and I don't know how many enlisted men we brought aboard to go to Pearl Harbor, where we joined the 5th Fleet at Pearl Harbor, I think it was. No, excuse me, it was the 3rd Fleet. And, well, as I say, we spent 2 days in San Diego, and we had Liberty that night. And a beautiful city. Very cold at night, though. At any rate, we arrived in Pearl Harbor.
And when you pulled in Pearl Harbor, did they observe any special recognition for the ships that had been bombed and were still probably remaining? No?
No. One of the first impressive incidents in Pearl Harbor, in my opinion, we went ashore for Liberty, and Liberty was up at 6 p.m. You go ashore in the morning, and you'd have to be back by 6 o'clock. They have many security precautions in Pearl Harbor because of the high Japanese population and even the Polynesian population. But at any rate, my first impression of Pearl Harbor was a good one. We got ashore at, I think it was Aiea Landing or Richardson Landing, one of the two. And there's a water fountain there, but there was no water. It was pineapple juice. The Dole
goodness sake.
Pineapple Company.
The plantation was, and they
Yeah.
provided the troops
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah, and that was free to everybody.
Oh, isn't that?
Yeah. So,
Probably after the food and beverages you got on ship, that was probably pretty nice to.
yeah, but I have to say this for the Houston. I've never eaten better,
Really?
really. We had great chefs, and we had great bakers.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. In fact, we had on Sunday night, in combat, not in actual combat, but in the combat zone, we had on Sunday night crepe Suzette. It wasn't flaming, but it was crepe Suzette.
Now, this wasn't standard fare for the rest of the United States Navy. Just the Houston had some talented
Well,
people there and a good supply officer.
Yeah, well, we had excellent supply officer, and our captain, Wild Bill Burns, who we'll allude to another time, he was a pretty good guy in some respects. When we'd hit a port and things were calm and cool, he would invite numerous Army or Marine groups aboard ship for Sunday dinner. And boy, how those fellows appreciated it. The food was excellent on the USS Houston. But of course, we were a combat ship, and when we pulled into a harbor for supplies, we had first choice of all the steaks and everything else. So.
Oh, that's very important, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it seems contrary to what a lot of men have ever reported to me. But I'm glad
Yep.
to hear that they.
Well, I'll tell you,
that was something that you remember that well.
it was hard not to put on weight.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so Pearl, where did you go, George?
Pearl, while at Pearl, an incident you might be interested in, berthing space was at a premium at Pearl. Most of the people just anchored out. But we at one time, we were at a dock, and the Indianapolis came in, and which became very, very famous later on. And
The Indianapolis that delivered parts of the atom bomb and was ultimately sunk on its return trip.
And she pulled alongside, and in fact, I think the term for that was rafting. They tied her up to the Houston, side by side. And we got to know the Indianapolis crew pretty well. In fact, the Indianapolis had a Catholic chaplain who I think was killed in the sinking of the Indianapolis a year later. And it was my first experience as a Catholic to experience general confession. Now, we had a Protestant chaplain, and he conducted Protestant services on Sunday morning, and the Indianapolis conducted Catholic services on Sunday morning, so we just rotated. And
Did many men participate?
oh yes, yeah, more than you might think. Yeah, it was first for me in quite a while, but as I say, it was my first experience with general confession, and I was sorry to hear later on that I think he lost his life in the sinking. But a number of our officers, Annapolis officers, were closely related to a number of the Annapolis officers on the Indianapolis. Indianapolis was a beautiful ship, beautiful lines to it, but it was old.
George, did you have, quite frequently, did you have drills, I suppose, when you're out to sea for both firing, gunnery, and other operations on the ship?
Constant.
And from your position in the radio room, C1, is that what you called it?
Radio 1.
Radio 1.
Central Radio.
Central Radio, okay. When those guns fired,
Yeah.
what would be your impression as you were at your station? Would
Well-
it vibrate the ship? Could you hear them fire?
Oh, I could hear them fire. Yeah, no question about that. It was a muffled type of noise. Unlike being out on deck, then you need to do something to protect your ears. But yeah, well, we heard them firing all the way. In fact, alongside the radio shack, either side of the radio shack, there were twin 5-inch 38s, which was a pretty fast firing weapon with pretty good range and good anti-aircraft capabilities. And then just behind that were quad 40 millimeter guns. They make quite a bit of noise too, and they fire even more rapidly. So when we were under attack by airplanes, that's all you heard was boom, 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 boom. Even the 20 millimeters got into action, which were pretty small for fighting aircraft, but even they got into action when the aircraft got close enough.
And a position in the radio room was to transmit between ships. I mean, the Houston was a ship of the line. Mm-hmm. And what size were her guns?
Our main battery was 6-inch.
6-inch.
Yeah, and our secondary battery was 5-inch, and then we had 40 millimeters, which there's another name for those, Beauforts, I think they call them. And then we had 20 millimeters, and that was it.
Now, would your main purpose would be to communicate between ships to keep things in contact?
During an actual battle condition, that was my primary job. It was voice radio primarily.
Okay.
And but it was VHF or UHF, so that you didn't have to worry about radio silence.
How would you receive what orders you had for what information to transmit?
I would receive that from my supervisor, who would get it from the CWO.
And they would say, send this immediately to such and such a ship? Or
yeah, but it was mostly, as I look back, response on my part.
Okay.
They would say, let me think of one of the. They would say something to the effect that execute to follow. Left turn so many degrees, and then there'd be silence. I'd have to repeat that back so there'd be no misunderstanding. And
so there was duplicity of every message?
Absolutely, yeah. Otherwise you'd have ships turning into each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then when the Admiral or whoever gave the order to execute, everybody executes.
How long was your tour? How long were you on at your station, let's say, before you were relieved?
Well, if it was ordinary cruising in a combat zone, which, and by saying that, you're in a combat zone, but you're not firing and fighting,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But you're ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're at GQ, that's a different ballgame. At GQ, I'd be there until the GQ ended. But otherwise, I'd be there for an hour, and I'd be relieved, and I'd go to another station for an hour on a 4-hour stint.
And what was the purpose of that? Was it to keep you fresh, keep you focused?
Keep you fresh and interested, I suppose.
Yeah. Could you view the outside of the ship? Did you have portholes? No. So you were in an enclosed compartment?
When people ask me about naval warfare, and I never saw anything.
Right, right.
I remember the night, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but when we were torpedoed, I think it was somewhere around 6 in the evening, but I'm not certain of that, because I saw nothing, except I did hear the torpedo hit and felt the torpedo hit. They dispatched a friend of mine, a good radio man, to Jerry Morissette, to go outside and reconnoiter was the term they used. And he came back and reported there's bodies in the water and there's oil all over the place and so on and so forth. That was my view of combat. So.
Well, why don't we, unless there's anything in between, why don't we talk about the incident and the engagement that ultimately led to the torpedoing of the Houston?
That's fine.
All right. What location were you at as far as what you knew at that time?
I was in main Radio 1, Central Radio, and I was copying Radio Honolulu, which was the station, and sometimes we'd be copying code from there at, maybe 5,500 miles away from the station. And that was low frequency, and it had all the problems that come with low frequency and distance. We would be problems with thunderstorms, problems with atmospherics and bounce effects and some of the radio waves and so forth. So you always had another person backing you up. But the #1 radio guy that was his responsibility to get those messages through. And they would come in, on real busy times, we'd be copying NPM Honolulu at 35 words a minute, coded groups. And you got to be a pretty good radio man to handle that.
You were involved in a task force?
Yes.
Is that what the nomenclature is?
We were at the time when we were torpedoed, we were at Task Force 38, and
And what was the mission at that time, George? Would you have understood that at the time, or only in
Oh, yeah, I
retrospect?
understood.
Okay.
Being in radio, you knew a whole lot more than most of the crew.
I would think.
In fact, one of my jobs also was to, along with 3 or 4 other people, to copy the press. And we would put out a 2-page, both sides, every day, press for the crew. And
Who scripted that? Supervisor.
yeah, I don't know. You mean who edited it?
Yeah, in other words, I suppose, I imagine a lot of people would want to talk to you to learn perhaps what you might know, to get an advanced knowledge of where the ship was heading. And
Well, depending upon the signal you were receiving, and we copied Reuters and all those different ones, you know, and the atmospherics, for the most part, there was no editing. You just copied, and if you were a good radio man, and fortunately I was one of those, they didn't edit your stuff, they just printed it. And sometimes they did have to edit out when you had more than 2 pages material.
so you felt your skills, between your training and your aptitude, you learned your job well,
Yes, I did.
and were proud of how you,
Well,
from your duties and responsibilities on that
I'm
ship.
glad you asked that, Kevin, because one night, I think it was 1 o'clock in the morning, the main radio, forward of the main radio was the decoding room. And we never spent any time in the decoding room. That was for people who decoded messages, the messages that we copied. And the communications was primarily copy, copy, copy. There was very little transmitting with that type of communication. So one night, or 1 o'clock in the morning, a supply officer who was a decoder, he come out and he wanted to know, who the hell is Gacony? Well, that was me. I used to sign my messages Gacinney. Sort of a prelude to this computer program today, I guess. What foresight. Anyway, he came out and he said, I want to know who Gacony is. And my supervisor, with whom I had a certain amount of respect for him. I didn't get along with him too well. But he respected my abilities and I respected his, and
His authority.
we worked okay.
Right.
He thought maybe I goofed up on a message. He goes, well, that's him right there, sir.
He was happy to point
Sonny
out.
says, I want to tell you, it's the first perfect message I've ever copied, 437 coded groups without an error. Well, that had to be pretty good on Honolulu's part, too, because they didn't make an error in sending it to me.
Yeah. Oh, that's...
Yeah, so that turned out pretty good, and I got promoted shortly thereafter. But anyway, that took care of the Panamanian situation.
Very good. Right, made up for that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. All right. What can you tell me about when the Houston engaged the enemy? How many ships were in that grouping? What were the circumstances that led up to it? What was the mission, first of all? I guess we should start with that.
Well, the mission was to neutralize the Japanese Air Force on Formosa, or Taiwan. And if you know the history of the Pacific War, we never did capture Formosa. It was a Japanese stronghold. But more importantly, the geographical location of Formosa to the Philippines meant that their aircraft could fly sorties into the Philippines and upset our program for invading the Philippines. Now, we had already been involved in softening up the Philippines prior to our going to Formosa. And in fact, we made the first raids on Clark Field and Nichols Field in the Philippines. And it became a part of history, too, because it was the first time in naval warfare that we turned on lights in order to take aboard aircraft who were running out of fuel. But they had
the pilots who might have ditched.
Yeah, and that was off the Philippines, and this is I'm guessing at the date, probably October 10, 11, somewhere around there. And so then, for whatever reasons, Halsey was the Admiral of the 3rd Fleet, and we were part of the 3rd Fleet. We were Task Group 38.5 or whatever. He sent us up to Formosa. I don't know how many ships we were in that. We were a task group, and a task group consists of your main ships are the carriers, and then you have cruisers or a battleship or two, and numerous destroyers. And we went up there to neutralize the Japanese Air Force so that they couldn't make runs to the Philippines. And we had pretty good success in bombing their airfields and the damage that we were able to do to them, but we couldn't complete it. And
would your ship have fired shells?
no, we did not. We didn't get that
so
close.
you were covering for the fleet carriers.
Right.
So that
which was our primary responsibility.
I see. Okay, yeah.
You know, originally, when the war started, everybody was battleship minded. And we learned very soon, battleships are passé. They're fine for bombarding an island,
right,
or a city or whatever, but what the real weapon was aircraft carriers. So eventually we switched around the whole naval program to protect the carriers, our main weapon.
I suppose a cruiser, because of its high speed, was very adept at that.
Especially a light cruiser, and because we could carry so much fuel, so much more fuel than most ships. And we could refuel destroyers even after we got refueled. But we were fast, and we were maneuverable, and we were also expendable. You'd always take a torpedo before you'd let the carrier take it. But the destroyers would take a torpedo before they let us take it. That's the way the Navy works.
So how did the day develop on the day that on October 14th, 1944, that the Houston was torpedoed?
Well, let's go the day before.
Okay.
We were raiding their airfields all day long with no opposition out here on the ocean. I don't know what our guys were experiencing in there, the pilots were experiencing, and they were the targets. But then, come dusk, they came out after us. And they had, most of the planes, as I understand it, were twin engine. I think they called them Bettys, or I've forgotten the names for them. It's not important, but and they were. It was only a few days before the kamikazes, so we did pretty good. I don't know how many we shot down. We had all sorts of paintings on our bridge for the number of aircraft we shot down and so forth. And all the other ships were having a field day too.
Would you get a sense of that in the radio room when a plane was shot down? No, you might not even be aware.
Nope.
You just hear the furious pounding of the guns, I suppose?
Yeah. And we could darken the sky with shells. We had that much firepower. But I missed all that. The radio men never saw that. Signalmen saw it all. But yeah, we raided them all day. The day before we were hit, and they came out at night, and we were successful in avoiding that. And the next day, that night, in another task group, the Canberra was hit. And she had a pretty good radar crew, as I understand it. So
that was another carrier that was...
no, the Canberra was a cruiser.
Was a cruiser.
But her radar was very important. And on defense, radar is everything. So for that reason, I guess, we were assigned to replace the Canberra in her group, because we had a super radar group on the Houston. And we spent the whole day prior to our torpedoing at full speed. No fresh water, no fresh showers, nothing like that. It was all going into the engines, for
boiler
condensers.
Water.
Yeah. And we spent that whole day at full speed to catch up with the group that the Canberra was with.
So the Canberra was torpedoed, was a cruiser, was torpedoed but not sunk.
Yeah.
And you were going to replace that ship on the line.
The Canberra was already under tow by, I don't know who. So we got there just in time. And I don't know what time we were hit. That book that you read might have given you the exact time, but
it was early evening.
Yeah, I know it was early evening. Whether it was 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, I don't know. Because by the time I got out on deck, it was dark. So We dodged quite a few that night. I knew when we were dodging.
You could feel the ship's
Oh, yeah,
evasive
sure.
maneuvers?
Yeah, yeah. And
No problem with seasickness?
no. The only time, I'll cover that in a second, the night after when we abandoned ship, I inadvertently swallowed diesel fuel, and that made me sick.
Okay.
That was the nearest I ever
Yeah,
came to
yeah.
being seasick. I retched half the night, but
So you're on line replacing the Canberra. The ship was being attacked
Yep.
by twin-engine Japanese aerial torpedo planes.
aerial torpedoes.
It had shot down several,
Yep,
but one ultimately hit.
yep.
Where did it strike?
It was, I guess for all practical purposes, I could say midship. I could, if I refer to your book, you could tell you the exact frame where it hit, but it knocked out all our propulsion.
What was your sensation, George, from where you sat? How could you recognize what had happened?
Well, I remember it well. It's like nothing I've ever experienced since. It was a loud explosion, and I had the feeling that the ship jumped out of the water. But we were in a high-speed turn when the torpedo hit, so it hit a strategic spot, which broke our keel. And not too many ships remain afloat after a broken keel. Not ships of that size. We were 700 feet long, but I just felt like boom. And
What was the lighting like in your room? Would it be darkened down normally when you were in battle stations like that,
no, if you
or was it brightly lit?
Yes, our doors, that's a layman's term, although airtight, they were light tight. And they were so equipped that if you opened the door, the lights went out. So, because you could see a light many miles away.
So that aircraft
dark.
wouldn't spot you. So
Yep,
that was a
yeah.
foolproof in case someone inadvertently opened it.
And when the lights go out, red lights would come on,
Yeah.
which could not be seen very far away. So,
I see.
Yeah, so you maintain.
So what was the first effect? Well, you say you felt the ship raise. You heard the explosion, you felt the ship raise. Did you lose lighting?
Yes, we had emergency lighting.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Did you feel the ship lose way?
oh yes, yeah, you feel that right away.
It lost power immediately?
And
Propulsion?
the emergency light went on, and lights went on, and they were adequate. You could do your job with the emergency lights, but there was nothing like having your regular lighting program.
How did the men, I mean, how did you, I suppose you looked around the room at the men that were with you?
And we were crowded, of course, as usual, when you're at GQ. And I remember, well, I think I mentioned a moment ago, the communications watch officer assigned Morissette to go out and see what was going on. And I replaced him at his position. And it was at that time, I think it was at that time or very close to it, I copied a message that was coming from, I think, Halsey, calling for a seagoing tug whose location I did not know to come to the aid of the Houston.
Now, when you say Halsey, you mean?
Admiral Halsey.
Admiral Halsey.
Bull Halsey.
Requesting a tug, a tow for
Yeah.
the,
He
and at that point you recognized that you were disabled, I suppose, or before that you knew?
Oh, I knew that.
You knew that.
Yeah, and
How were communications at that point? How were you communicating? Did you have auxiliary power to receive or send messages?
we had no communication.
No communication.
Nope. I don't even think we had communications with the radar people below us in the Combat Information Center.
So you couldn't even talk intership?
No. And that was one of the problems. Our captain, he's on the bridge in combat. And you see that picture, the length of that ship. He has to know what's going on in the forward part, after part, and the midships and all over. And he had to depend upon people running up to him with the information. And he didn't get enough information, to be honest with you. But yeah, the communications were out, and they were working on trying to reinstall it, but to date they hadn't. And then our communications watch officer, he came into the radio room, And he said, I guess we better get rid of the typewriters. It was standard procedure. You had to throw them overboard because of security purposes. I guess a good Japanese code breaker could take the cylinders off a typewriter and make something out of it. I don't know how they would, but
So you were instructed to remove all that equipment and throw it over.
I enjoyed that.
So that was that was the first point that you were able to go out of
I went out.
your location, yeah?
And by the way,
What was your first impression? Eerie?
yeah, there was a destroyer pulled alongside on the port side.
What side of the ship did the torpedo strike?
On the starboard side.
On the starboard side, yeah.
This is the opposite side, port side. And the destroyer came alongside, but it was a stormy night. And the destroyer kept banging into the Houston. And I remember our captain, he had a megaphone. And I remember, I can't recall his exact words, but he told the skipper of the destroyer, you better shove off because...
You're doing damage.
Yeah, well, he said, not only that, you'll sink yourself.
They were thinner skinned than a
much thinner,
cruiser, yeah?
So, and meanwhile, there were people jumping from my ship onto the destroyer, and some who didn't make it. They, as they'd separate, but they were non-swimmers, I guess, but they didn't get a chance to learn. At any rate, yeah, that was my first scene, and
what was the sky like? What was the weather like that evening?
it was stormy, but it wasn't raining, and I could see.
Sun was set?
Oh yes.
So it was a twilight?
Oh, it was even later than that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I could see, and I could see the captain on the bridge, and I was probably maybe 100 feet away. So there was enough light for me to see. But your eyes were accustomed to the darkness at that point too, you know. So with that, I can't recall the captain ever saying abandon ship, but I saw people abandoning the ship. And my abandoned ship station was right where I was standing, right outside the radio shack. And I had a big raft there. And we had practiced abandoning ship at times. So a few people gathered around. Some of them that wasn't even their abandoned ship station. And I, being a strong swimmer, I really wasn't upset about going in the water, but I just wondered when.
How long between, let's say, the torpedoing and when you had to leave the ship?
Probably close to an hour.
Okay.
Or between a half hour and an hour, yeah. And
did you look for people you knew, or did you just...
No, I knew I knew most of the people who were assigned to that abandoned ship station.
Yeah.
But there were many people there who weren't assigned to it.
Was it orderly or was it chaotic?
It was chaotic. Principally because, and this is my opinion, I don't know if it's ever been written in the book, but I think the number of people aboard my ship who couldn't swim was a problem at that time, and it's understandable, you know. When you're on a sinking ship, if you can't swim.
But yet I have to think back in your boot camp in Sampson, didn't the Navy make you participate or reach a certain level of swimming?
I'm glad you asked that question, Kevin. Yes, and you had to jump off a tower in the drill shed into a pool. I think the tower was 15 or 20 feet high, and which is no sweat for a guy who's used to diving off any kind of diving board and can swim. But it's a terrible, terrible thing for a guy who doesn't know how to swim to go up on a tower and jump into.
Yeah.
So an acquaintance of mine, he wasn't only a few bunks away from me in boot camp. I could name him if it was necessary. He couldn't swim. So he climbed the tower, and he had a life jacket on, K-Pock, you know. They teach you how to do it, because if you jump from a height with a K-Pock life jacket, you could break your neck. So they teach you, and you could also do a job on
how to protect yourself.
Other parts of you. So I forgot now what it was, but you had to grab the K-Pock collar here,
grab down
and
below,
yourself there, and jump.
Make the jump.
So Calvin, he wouldn't jump. And finally they threatened him, and he jumped. But he froze in the water. And he was not a gutless type of guy. He boxed, he was a good man, but he couldn't swim. He froze in the water, and I foolishly dove in to pull him into the side of the pool. I felt so bad for him. I caught hell for it.
Did you?
Yeah. But there was no punishment or anything like that. So,
well, probably in the Navy's rush, I got to assume, and there's the rush to staff the ships and the tremendous need for men, they were pushing people through those
sure they were.
as quick as possible.
And that's one of the things I learned when it took us, let's see, we were torpedoed in October. We got back to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in April. And the first thing they did was all the non-swimmers, well, they made everybody go to swimming class in Brooklyn. And anybody that couldn't swim the length of the pool, they remained and had to go every night.
But that evening, when you were torpedoed, that was one of your things you recognized, was the fact that there were men who were unable to swim.
Yeah.
And probably some men perished because of that.
I remember one fellow coming to me, hey, George, he says, what do I do? Do I take off my shoes? I take off your shoes if you want. Leave them on if you want. Better off leave them on.
Okay, so you're at your station, your abandoned ship station, group of men, and ultimately who had to give the order? I mean, I assume the captain did.
Oh, the abandoned ship?
Yeah.
No, he did not.
Oh, okay.
No. But
well, of course, communications were out.
that's right. And when we were told to dump the typewriters, fine and dandy. That's sufficient cause to think that, hey, something's going on here.
Yeah.
And when I saw the captain, when I observed him telling the destroyer to pull off, meanwhile he had watched and observed these people jumping from his ship and never said anything that I know of. So, hey, I figured 2 and 2 made 4. So I gave the order to my people to go, and no one wanted to be first. So I said, well, okay. Now there was a rope across the deck. I thought, well, I'll let myself down easy. Why jump into it? So we were up on the second deck. So I grabbed the rope, went over, and the rope wasn't tied to anything. So I went ass over tea kettle into all that fuel oil.
Oh, my.
And that's where I swallowed the fuel oil
I
and got
see.
sick.
Yeah.
But
well, in fact, the abandoned ship order had been given. It's understood that the communications were out, and most parts of the ship didn't hear it. It was assumed, and about 2/3, I understand, of the crew abandoned ship at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so what was your experience? You swallowed fuel oil. You scrambled into the raft. How many men did the raft hold?
No, we didn't. The raft wouldn't hold all of us.
I see.
No, it would hold 1 or 2. And incidentally, the raft entered the water upside down, so the water and all supplies and everything were underneath.
Oh.
And there were, I think, 35 or 38 of us.
Were there any more Japanese aircraft in the area, in the vicinity?
We saw our ships firing, tracers.
So your ship was still able to...
Not my ship.
Oh, all right,
No,
I'm sorry.
we weren't firing, that I know of, but we saw other ships firing, probably destroyers or something like that. So the Japanese aircraft had to be there. They were firing at something.
So it was dark, you're in the water, there's oil. Was there a fear of fire?
No.
No.
I don't know about board ship. There may have been, but I don't know of any.
How many men clustered around that raft?
About 38.
38.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of them?
Oh,
any of the
yes.
names?
Yeah. In fact, one person in particular, a fellow by the name of Danforth, he was from Boston, a light, slightly built fellow, nice man, good radio man too. It was a stormy night, and just 2 or 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, we had kind of given up hope of being rescued, and this fellow looked up at the sky as the most fervent prayer I've ever heard, and I can repeat it almost verbatim.
What was it, George?
He looked up at the sky and he says, Lord, if you really want me, you can have me, but not here. Home, in my own bedroom, in a clean white sheet, and my mother in the room. That's a prayer.
But it was from the heart.
Was it ever?
Yeah.
I lost track of him. I would like to see him today if he's still alive, but most of my contemporaries are gone.
So you say it was stormy. There was some wind, the swells.
Yeah.
Did you ever turn the raft right side up?
No,
or
we
weren't able
didn't.
to?
No, we weren't able to.
So you had no drinking water?
No.
No
Nothing.
supplies?
No,
No
nothing.
lights?
No.
No flashlight?
Well, we had a couple of us had flashlights that we had attached to our belts.
Was that part of your safety gear?
Yeah,
mean,
it wasn't mandatory, but
Yeah, all
we
right.
had it. And we
Were
had
there
it-
other rafts
we
around?
had them in condoms
To keep them waterproofed.
Yeah. But there was no one to flash to.
All the other ships
They're all-
disappeared from the scene?
They were still,
They were in
the
motion.
battle. Yeah.
Sure.
So, but they assigned 3 destroyers to
Stand by.
to
And to pick
search
up.
for us.
Yeah, okay.
And well, the destroyer that picked us up was the USS Grayson. It was a converted old 4-piper, and
But it sounded like at one point there wasn't anything in sight? Or did you always
no, there was nothing in sight
Okay.
after a little while.
So the order came for those ships to return to that area. They knew at that point that the Houston was wounded
Yeah.
and to search for survivors.
Yeah. Well, meantime, they decided they're going to try and save the Houston, so they ordered the USS Boston, another cruiser, to take it into tow until such time as the seagoing tugs arrived, which would be the next day. And to this day, I don't know where the tugs came from, but they were there the next day. But to get back to being in the water that night, we were hoping that we knew that they would do their best to rescue us if we could.
So you felt confident?
Yeah. And we knew that we were, I think, 30 or 35 miles off the coast of Formosa, which, as I mentioned earlier, we never did capture. So we had a little powwow on our raft, and we had a fellow on the raft who was, I guess you'd call him a root suiter. You know what they are?
No.
Oh, they were the ducktail haircuts and the peg pants and the,
Okay.
chains, long chains, and so that.
Kind of a dude.
Yeah, and this guy was he was the kind of a guy that, I'm not going to mention his name, but about the only thing you could assign him to was making coffee. And he screwed that up too. You couldn't buy a percolator, and he made coffee one night without water, and the percolator melted all over, and they wanted to kill
So
him.
his skill level was somewhat compromised.
Well, anyway, he knew enough about radio or observed enough about it that we said, boy, if we get captured, all we got to do is give our name, serial number, and rate. Yeah, but what about so-and-so? I don't want to mention his name. Well, we'll drown him right now. And I saved his life.
He was serious.
Oh.
Was there any, who was the highest rank on your raft? Was there any of that issue?
The highest rank was a warrant officer, a fellow by the name of D. He was an older man.
Did he try to take control of the situation at all?
No, he was so beat up that he survived.
Yeah.
And I met, just a few years ago, I met his son, who was very happy to make acquaintance
that's
with me and to
interesting.
hear about his father.
Yeah, that's a good point. Was anybody else wounded or injured on the raft?
No.
Other than now, what was it like to follow, like you say, your first gulp of water was full of fuel oil? What
Yeah.
did that nauseate you?
I had never tasted fuel oil before.
I can imagine.
No, I didn't think a thing of it until it started working on my stomach. And I had an empty stomach. We hadn't eaten.
Yeah.
We were at GQ all day. So you didn't get to go to the mess hall. So that did a job on me. And plus,
Did it make you vomit?
yeah, oh sure. But there wasn't much to vomit. Then you start retching.
Yeah.
And I guess, well, I had a real sympathy for the poor people who were seasick all the time, because I never was.
So you were uncomfortable,
Yeah, oh,
to
yeah.
say the least,
Yeah, that's a good way
and
to
in
put
a
it.
compromised position.
Oh,
So what time did you said it was the Grayson that picked you up?
USS Grayson.
And what time did that happen?
Well, it was just before dawn, and that's an interesting thing, too. Just prior to her picking us up, and it was the Grayson, we didn't know it was the Grayson at the time, we were bobbing up and down, and we saw this searchlight covering the water, the surface. We said, oh boy, we're going to get rescued. And just as the searchlight came here, we went down in the trough and it went right over us. And oh, we were sick over that.
So close, but yet
hope he
so
does
far.
it again.
Yeah.
But they didn't. But they did have us on radar.
Was there any concern of sharks?
No,
No.
no. The water was, I don't know if the water was cold enough, but you're in the water all that time. You get pretty, well, I don't know if there was any hypothermia, but you get pretty cold.
Yeah, sure, cooled off.
In fact, I had an experience with when the destroyer pulled alongside of us. That was only maybe a half hour after that searchlight went by us, and boy, our hopes sank down to the depths when that searchlight went over our head. But they had, I found out later, they had seen us on radar and they were determined to get us.
Really? They picked you up on radar?
Yeah, and they came, we have a pretty good surface radar. I'd like to cover that before we're through here, the difference between 1943 and 44.
It was a great improvement.
Radar, yeah. But anyway, the destroyer pulled alongside us and they pulled us all up one by one, threw down these little life rings on a rope and hoisted us up. And everybody was scrambling to get to and I said, I'm not going to die this way. I said, I'll wait. They'll wait for me. So I was the last one off the raft. They put the life ring down for me, and I hooked onto it. They pulled me up, which isn't very far on a destroyer. They're not too far above the water. And there was a big bosun mate there with a beard, typical destroyer sailor. He says, can I help you to the showers? And I said, no, I'm just grateful you picked me up. So he let go of me, and I went, boom, my legs gave out.
Oh, really?
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't have this. So he picked me up and carried me to the shower. And, of course, we were unrecognizable. We were all black from the fuel and everything. And he helped scrub me down. And they were terrific.
Took
they were
good
great.
care of you.
Yep.
George, when you're on the raft, any sleep at all, or did you
No.
find yourself nodding off? No, you had to hang on for dear life.
We were all pretty young.
Yeah.
I was 19, and I was one of the younger ones.
Can you any recollections where your mind traveled in that time?
Oh yes, yeah. I thought of one of the things I thought of. One of the many things I thought of my boss back in Albany.
Really? Why would that be? Who
later became a founder of the Cisco food distributors. Did you see their big trucks around all over?
Oh, sure.
And I remember him always sweating out his deposit every day. And I'm saying to myself, I wouldn't give a damn if I owed $100 million. What the hell do I care? All I want to do is stay alive.
Right.
Yeah. And I told him about that too later on when I got back to the States.
Right. All of a sudden, survival meant more than money, meant more than a lot of things.
What's money?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. How about home and mom and dad and things like that?
Oh, you bet. Yeah. My father was gone, but I thought of my mother and sisters all the time. And I had a girlfriend back home too at the time. I thought of her a lot. But at a time like that, I think you can't help but wonder, why am I still alive? How come, Lord? What do you want of me? Yeah. I'm not sure of what he wanted of me yet, but I think
It sort of made you question your existence and what your purpose was.
Got married and had 8 children and progressed in business and so on and so forth. So I guess that must be part of it.
Yeah, that's the way to look at it. George, with the torpedoing of the Houston, did you personally know any of the sailors who were killed?
Yes. In fact, I didn't know him well. I just, as a nodding acquaintance, a fellow from Albany by the name of Przinski. I think he was a motor machinist, first class, pre-Pearl Harbor sailor. Probably a career man, I don't know. But he was one of the first ones killed.
At what point did you, as part of the crew who abandoned ship, did you learn the deaths? How did you learn of the deaths, and how did you learn the crew members' names and who had died?
Well, it was. It took quite a bit of time to find out who was entombed in the ship. In fact, some of the bodies we didn't recover until we wound up in Manus Island at the dry dock where we could drain the ship.
So as compartments flooded, those men
trapped?
trapped?
Yeah. And And that had to be at least 1 month, maybe more, after the torpedoing. And by that time, the bodies were in pretty bad shape. And it was a traumatic thing for me because I could not stand the smell of the bodies. And I used to have to leave the ship when they were doing that and go whichever way the wind was blowing, the opposite.
So the ship carried those dead sailors, and the smell of death permeated the ship. Mm-hmm. I suppose there was no power on ship, no ventilation.
I don't think we had ventilation at the time. We may have, because we did some repair work at Ulithi, an island, an atoll. We were tied up to a repair ship, the USS Hector. I know we were there for Thanksgiving because I had that Thanksgiving menu. But we did get electrical power and what have you going there, and made the ship seaworthy enough to be towed from Ulithi to Manus Island. So I think we did have power for whatever was necessary, but we never had air conditioning, not in those days.
On the Grayson, how much time were you on that before they?
You showed me a picture earlier of the second torpedoing of the Houston, which didn't amount to an awful lot. It hit the rear end of the ship, which is our hangar, and it made a terrific explosion, though. And not a friend of mine, but an acquaintance of mine happened to be standing on the hangar, and shoo, he went into orbit. Survived. In fact, he was picked up by the Grayson. But no, things are good on the Grayson. I'll tell you a little anecdote here that impressed me. After I got showered and got cleaned up a little bit, and we were desperate for some sleep, so a fellow brought me down to the compartment that housed the radio men on the destroyer. And if you think quarters and conditions on a cruiser are tight, small, they're much tighter and smaller on a destroyer. Well, there was an empty bunk. So I had all my wet clothes, and I hung them on some sort of a hook there on the bulkhead, and they're still dripping. I laid down on the bunk, the guy assigned to me. He was a radio man, young fellow. And I don't know how long I slept. It was probably 10:30 or so when I woke up. And here's this guy who gave me his bunk. I didn't know it was his bunk. He's laying on the deck in all the water that dripped down from my clothes, sleeping. That's a man I had never known before.
Yeah, I'm sure you were grateful to him.
Oh, was I ever. I felt, well, I can't explain my feelings at that, but...
No, but something so basic, so simple, meant so much.
Yep. And that kind of describes naval life, though, to a degree, you know.
You felt the comradeship was important, and watch out for each other?
Yeah.
So where did the Grayson land you, George?
Well, that's a story in itself. I got so much experience after the torpedoing. The Grayson, I don't know what day it was. It must have been the third day aboard the Grayson. I got to know the commander of the Grayson. I pestered him for all kinds of information. He told me how he and the other destroyers, the concentric circles and so on and so forth, and then out and around. So great how they got, and everybody was rescued. I talked to him at great length, and I enjoyed it very much. But he told me, he said, "We've got to get rid of you fellas."
How many men were taken on board?
We're running out of I don't know how many the total was, but certainly the 30-some people that I was with were taken aboard. We're running out of cigarettes. We're running out of food.
You were depleting all their reserves.
Yeah, and they were still in combat.
Yep. Did you ever see the Houston again after you were picked up on the Grayson, or did you leave it behind?
Yes, I saw the torpedo, the second torpedo.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, from about 4 or 5 miles distance.
So while it was under tow by the Pawnee, the seagoing tug, or was it still being towed by the Boston?
I don't recall. Probably the Pawnee. I don't know. I don't recall what was towing it, but I saw the hit.
So there was insult to injury right there.
Yeah, and none of that, but the commander of the destroyer and that was his title. He was a commander. He circled to pick up a survivor, a fellow by the name of Chadwick, who was blown off the ship with that torpedo and survived pretty well. So then they had to get rid of us. And their first choice was the USS Birmingham, a heavy cruiser. So we pulled alongside the Birmingham. We didn't tie up to her or anything like that. We just came alongside, maybe 100 feet away. And they throw across a breeches buoy. You wouldn't dare stop because it was in combat zone.
For fear of submarines or what have you.
Sure.
So the ships were in motion. They connected with ropes and a
Right.
simple swing
Right.
and a pulley.
Breeches buoy. I guess they call him a bosun chair now. And that's how we transfer from the destroyer to the cruiser.
I imagine that's kind of a delicate operation.
Oh, it's exciting. You can get a wet ass if they.
If the ships converge a little bit, you're in the dunking booth.
Yep.
Now, how did you fare? You came across okay?
Quite well. Yeah. And that was only my first. So we got aboard the Birmingham, and we no more than got the last man aboard and said goodbye to the Grayson. Then GQ, the Jap fleet, come out. So the Birmingham sounded GQ, and the chief radio man, he started assigning people to positions. And he said, "You, Cinney, you go down to radio 3. Chief, I'd rather go to the brig before I go to radio 3.
Where was radio 3?
Way down in the bowels of the ship, and I had enough of the below water stuff. So
did you have a premonition? You just didn't like the feeling?
I just didn't want to go there. I didn't want to expose myself if I didn't have to.
Was he understanding?
He was I wish I'd gotten his name. He looked at me and he said, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "I'll go up in the bridge with the captain." He says, "Well, you're superfluous, but go ahead, stay out of the way." I said, "Okay, fine, thank you." That's the last I saw of him.
Yeah.
Went up there in the bridge, and I wasn't up there but a very short period of time, less than a half hour. And the Princeton, a Class A carrier, was hit with a kamikaze, and she was burning fiercely.
Within eyesight?
No.
Oh, okay, so you got reports.
The Birmingham was assigned to go and help her fight her fires. Now we had another problem. They had to get rid of all this personnel first. So the captain gave the order, and just off, a short ways off, was what they call a Kaiser Coffin, which is a baby aircraft carrier. And she came alongside, and I breeches buoy over. I got to be real experienced at this. So we all get transferred to the aircraft carrier. And shortly thereafter, the Birmingham tied up to the Princeton, helped fight our fires. And all of a sudden, the Princeton blew all to hell. And I don't know if everybody on the bridge got killed, but there was severe damage on the bridge, which were where I would have been by my own choice. And I said, "Lord, why?"
That's twice in a short period of time.
Yeah, in a couple of days.
Yeah.
So it was a great experience. I'm glad I survived it.
We are too.
Yeah, thank you.
It's fascinating. What did you do in the interim time from when the ship was torpedoed and towed to Ulithi? What was your job, your assignment after that?
Well, I go a little bit before that. After having abandoned the ship, along with 600 or 700 other people, we wound up on two merchant ships. It was gradual. We transferred from one to the other. We finally wound up on two merchant ships, Liberty ships. And we were brought to Pearl Harbor, which was, maybe 6 or 7 days' journey. And when we got to Pearl Harbor, we were quite elated over the fact that they were coming aboard to take all our measurements for hats and clothing and what have you, which meant we were going to the States. In fact, they were due to leave the following morning, 2 shiploads of survivors, to go to San Francisco. That meant home. And that night, late in the evening, a message from the Third Fleet came through that 3 of us radio men had to take transportation, fly, I think it was a China Clipper or something akin to it. It was a big seagoing airplane. We had to fly back to the combat zone and rejoin the Houston. And we all were.
Devastated at that news.
Yes,
to miss an opportunity to get home.
Well, it was pretty good to get home, you know. But anyway, that was our fate. And I guess because we were good radio men, that's why, because the lesser men didn't have to do that. They went home. In fact, I gave one fellow instructions to take my girlfriend out, which he very dutifully did.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.